Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the latest in TEFAF's series of panel discussions, which is running as a wonderful program in conjunction with TEFAF Online, the second edition of the Fair Online, which is currently underway. I'm Jan Dalley. I'm the arts editor at the Financial Times in London, and I'm absolutely delighted to be the moderator this evening of a wonderful panel. We have a really important and fascinating subject to discuss. Our title tonight is Restoring Public Masterpieces for Future Generations. And what we're talking about is TEFAF's Restoration Fund. The organisers of the fair organised this philanthropic award of funds to public institutions across the world every year to restore certain particular pieces that they consider especially significant. So tonight we're going to hear about two projects, this year's projects. They're very different, but of course, in some ways, all restoration has much in common, and I hope we'll be discussing that. So the first of them is the restoration of a portrait by Manet, which is held in the National Museum of Wales, based in Cardiff. And we're going to hear tonight from Adam Webster, who is masterminding this restoration project. The second project, a very, very different one, we will be hearing from the Archaeological Museum at the American University of Beirut, which of course suffered a terrible tragedy in August of this year when the dreadful explosion that happened in the city shattered a large number of very particular and special glass objects. Some of these objects are being painstakingly reassembled and restored in collaboration with the British Museum in London. So we have with us Nadine Panayot from Beirut and James Fraser from the British Museum, although actually he's in Paris because, you know, he just likes to do that. But normally you're in London, aren't you, James? So a tremendous welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, look, let's jump straight in and hear a little bit about these remarkable projects. Nadine, may I start with you? Tell us the background to this awful tragedy that happened in your museum and how you've how the restoration project has come into being.
Okay, well, thank you very much for hosting us. This happened back in August 2020, August 4th, 2020, when there was the when the Beirut port was blown away with this almost what we call a nuclear, almost nuclear blast. So it basically destroyed half of Beirut, half of the city of Beirut. AUB got its fair share, let's say, of destruction, the museum as well. The museum is hosted in a historical building dating back to the early 1900s. So it lost huge, large windows, 17 of those windows. All 5 doors of the museum were completely blown away. And luckily, none of the showcases had moved 1 inch. But in one of the hallways, we had the central and very beautiful showcase that used to contain 74 pieces, glass vessels that date back from the early Roman all the way to the late Roman, Byzantine, Umayyad, and then medieval period. So it was completely, it fell straight onto the floor, marble floor, shattering 72 pieces out of the total of 74. So 2 pieces were miraculously survived because they were tiny goblets, but the rest was completely smashed. So this is when the, already to recollect those pieces, just picking them up from the floor was quite a challenge and an adventure, because you had to sift through thousands of shards you know, between the windows, the glass coming from the windows, the glass from the showcase itself, the shelves, and then finally to get to these, you know, beautiful archaeological pieces. So some of those, when we talk about shards, we're talking, some of them are millimeters big. So it was a huge challenge to actually even consider restoring some of those pieces. Just thinking about it is just mind-boggling. So things started when I finally received a call from the British Museum offering their help and their support. And this was really an amazing call because it gave me hope. I was looking at this mass of glass, swimming in glass, and then I get this call and I thought, well, there is hope. If someone is willing to help, then maybe we can do something about it. And this is how this project started, slowly but surely.
Well, it's almost, as you say, it's almost mind-boggling, the idea that you can even contemplate putting such things together. So James, tell us about it from the British Museum's point of view. You presumably decided which of these very delicate pieces you might be able to work with. I can't imagine that you're working with all 72 of them, but presumably some were considered better candidates than others for the restoration.
Yeah, so I mean, I remember I was babysitting my baby niece actually on the 4th of August, and I had the BBC News on in the background and playing a little game with my niece, and then the explosion images of Lebanon came on the TV, and I mean, it was arresting. And I think, like everyone here, just watching those images was extremely distressing for all our friends and colleagues in Lebanon. That the next day, the museum's director at the British Museum, Hartwig Fischer, gave me a call, and another curator who's the curator for the Contemporary Middle East, Zaina Klink-Hopp, and he asked us to reach out to colleagues and friends in Lebanon and identify any sorts of projects that we could offer assistance to. The reason why this project became this project, I guess, was because, of course, the British Museum, its strengths lies in antiquity, and a lot of the galleries and museums that were most significantly affected were museums such as the Sursuk Museum, which holds contemporary art. And there was a lot of assistance coming from the art community for those sorts of projects, incredibly tragic. But the museum at AUB, of course, with these smashed glass vessels, that plays quite well to the strengths that the British Museum has in terms of its facilities of conservation and its expertise in conservation, particularly glass conservation. And I think that is something where we thought we could offer some technical assistance and offer some real help, that we could help, you know, move towards a finished goal. And I guess then liaising with Nadine was exhilarating, actually. To speak with someone who is so enthusiastic and so has such initiative as to what can be done, and to see 17 steps ahead. And I think the project has kind of blossomed out of that. And then, of course, getting funding from TEFAF actually made it possible.
Well, that's wonderful. Now, to the audience, I expect you're already full of questions that you'd like to ask. So please send in your questions as we go along. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Just write down the questions. They will all come to me and I'll take them at the end of the session. We've got an hour together, but I will leave 15 minutes for your questions. So as you think of your questions as they come along, send them along. But next, let's turn to Adam in Wales and hear about your project. Now, behind your head, we have in fact got the portrait. He's a rather stern-looking gent. It came into your possession, I gather, by what they call the Acceptance in Lieu scheme, which is a government scheme by which artworks can be given to the state instead of paying tax. But tell us first of all who he is, who the subject is, because I gather he was pretty important to Manet. He was quite important in his life, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he's his cousin, and he was a lawyer and really championed Manet during his life. So he was a sort of mentor figure, and also organised exhibitions with Manet's work in. So really, personally, a very important person in Manet's life.
So this was really a personal project more than I mean, this is not any old commission for Manet, is it? It's somebody he was very fond of and who really meant a lot to him. And he certainly he's got a kindly face. It's a little bit hard to see, but
Yes.
I imagine the restoration work will give him quite a bit more personality.
I think saying yes, it's quite hard to see is sort of crux of the problem really here. He has a layer of surface dirt, which is sort of black particulate dirt, which usually means he's been somewhere urban for a while. And he has a yellow varnish. And just looking at it, actually yesterday, really pressing my nose into the surface, I can see how yellow that varnish is and the sort of immediate impact of that. And you can see it just here now. It's a sort of flattening of any sort of depth. And we've definitely got that here. And because this kind of painting relies on a light ground layer showing through his face. And when you see his face in sort of close up, there's an awful lot of the light ground layer showing through and some very sort of nifty touches from Manet, but really quite minimal. So if that's essentially covered with a yellow and dark varnish or veil over it, then all of that's deadened. So I think the intimacy that we're talking about and the personal knowledge that he would have had of that particular face will really start to come through once we start cleaning the painting.
Tell us a bit about where it's been. Where has it been, this painting, all these years?
Well, he's been in private. Sorry.
No, please.
He's been in private hands, so he's for around the last 60 years. So in terms of sort of public circulation, this is his sort of step back out into the light. And prior to that, he'd been exhibited in Berlin and Paris, in America. It was a widely exhibited painting prior to the private collection. So he sort of stepped back into the light, basically. And in the context of this particular organisation, we have a very, one of our strengths, I suppose, is French 19th century art. And the Davis sisters bequeathed their massive collection of Impressionist and post-Impressionist art to the museum, and overnight sort of transformed the collection. And one of the incredible things about that collection is they're in incredible condition, because the sisters were buying directly from Paris and stuff. So really they haven't changed hands much. So we're in the unique position of having paintings that haven't been lined or cleaned or treated a great deal. And so a lot of them are in very crisp, in a very crisp state, which often when we take things on loan, other organizations really sort of admire. And this painting is similarly unlined and all of that. So again, we've got something that's in a pretty good condition, but aesthetically compromised. And I think once we've done the work on him, then it will sit very comfortably in our galleries. And we have 3 other Manet paintings as well. Again, that he will slot in very nicely with.
Well, it's remarkable. So as you see, there are 2 very, very, very different projects here, completely different in terms of processes, in terms of end result, and in a way in terms of the necessity. I mean, one was brought about by a disaster, another is the normal action of time and degradation of a picture. So I really wanted to widen the debate out a little bit and ask you all about in general, the processes of restoration. I mean, in a little while, if we want to, we can go into some of the more detailed aspects of each of your projects. But I think what unites you both and what unites this project year on year is the whole notion of of restoration, of restoring public masterpieces for future generations, which is what we're talking about. When you're restoring or mending, as in the case of the Beirut material, is this, I assume that this is a chance to do a lot of other work, such as research, for example. Nadine, your objects, perhaps you knew everything you needed to know about them anyway, but does this restoration process tell you any more about them? I mean, is it a chance for learning and finding out and doing more work around them?
Definitely, absolutely. Basically, indeed, I mean, in general terms, when you look at a collection in a museum, you think that you know everything. And actually, scientifically, this restoration is not needed for scientific purposes. It's needed really only for curating, if you want, or for the museum world. It is needed because in a museum, you basically exhibit objects that tell stories. And these objects have now new stories to tell. That's on one end. On the other end, if we talk about science and if we talk about the importance of these objects per se, they're not, of course, each one of them is particular, each one of them is unique, but there are so many other glass artifacts dating back to the Roman period around the world, not just in the Middle East, I mean, all around the museums. But the idea is that we can take advantage, and I hate this expression, but that's the fact, that's the way things are today, of this tragic event, of the fact that they are completely shattered, to use some of these fragments for science. So we've put together, now I'm working on a workshop, I was going to invite my colleagues here to actually join that workshop when it takes place. So we're still working on the concept of several themes that we will be discussing. One is restoration. The other one is the scientific value, the typology, the archaeology of these objects and what they mean and what they can teach us in terms, what we did not know as archaeologists. Is there something more they can teach us? The other thing would be to reach that end, we would be running some tests, using new technologies, using X-rays, using maybe chemical reactions with some of the fragments that are non-restorable as well. This can help with the composition of the glass itself. Another aspect as well that I am also experimenting at the museum right now is the 3D restoration. The digital restoration. So we have a project that has already produced several 3D restorations of these objects. And this is quite interesting as well, because 3D restoration on glass is quite challenging. Unlike, for example, on clay or ceramics or something solid, which is not transparent. Turns out that 3D restoration on glass is extremely tricky, even for the best, computer geek. So these are all the, different aspects that we can look at and try to bring something good out of this tragedy.
Explain 3D restoration a little more. Do you mean a modeling? Do you make a digital model?
Yes, computer modeling. You look at the fragments, you position them, you try to position them virtually using computer modeling. And this actually can help not handling the pieces with your hands, especially that some of them are extremely fragile. The iridescence that covers this ancient glass doesn't allow you to handle them and touch them for a long time, although you need that to try to fix those pieces and puzzle those pieces together. You need to handle them. So going virtually can help you do the exercise without actually touching the objects or the fragments.
How interesting. James, have you been involved in a project, anything like this before? Or is this uncharted territory for you?
Well, I'm a curator of the ancient Levant with an archaeological background. So I'm a bit more of a blunt instrument than what's required for something as technical as this. But certainly our conservators of the museum have done a lot of work on this before. I guess personally, I was working on a dig in Jordan a few years ago, and the excavator in the trench nearby where I was working came into an earthquake level from the early Umayyad, early Islamic period. And in the back of what had been a church and then converted was a whole storeroom full of remarkable finds. This is from a site called Pella in the Jordan Valley, including the most elaborate wine set, decanter and several goblets and a mixing bowl, which had been crushed when the roof fell on them. So very similar, I guess, complete sort of glass vessels destroyed in one moment. And I watched over the course of 6 weeks, the conservator on that project, in a fairly basic conservation lab, very slowly, very painstakingly build these vessels back out of nothing. And it was the most magical thing to see. Yeah, I wouldn't have the temperament to do it. I would tear what's left of my hair out before I got to the end.
You wouldn't have the patience. And that one must have been even harder because you didn't know in advance what they looked like, what they were meant to look like. You had to work that out.
Yeah, mind you, in this case, and I think this is getting back to what Nadine was saying before about the condition, the emergency kind of first aid that she and her colleagues were doing. I mean, you're right that we know what the cover of the puzzle box looks like, but imagine 72 puzzle boxes where you've tipped all the pieces in one pile, and then you've got other random pieces from other puzzles because there's mixed up window glass and mixed up glass from the case. And so we know, and particularly Nadine and her colleagues trying to sort out what's there, we know what the finished puzzle box looks like, but which of the 72 puzzle boxes it goes to is really difficult. So there's an added challenge there, I think.
It sounds absolutely as we just said, mind-boggling. And how many pieces are you aiming to restore to sort of not quite their full beauty? Because as I think you explained, you are actually going to leave the mending visible, aren't you? Yeah.
So of those 72 vessels, the work in Beirut is ongoing to try and work out. It's called puzzle work, actually, to try and work out which of these fragments go with which of the particular vessels. And that's what Nadine and the conservator from the Institut National du Patrimoine in Paris and her other colleagues and student volunteers have been doing. When we applied to TEFAF funding, it was quite early on in the process. And at that point, Nadine and her staff had identified, and Nadine, jump in if I'm getting this wrong, but about 15 vessels that were potentially restorable. That is enough shards in good enough condition to actually mend back together. But of those, only about 8 had the pieces that were robust enough to survive the travel from Beirut to London. And so we'll take those 8 vessels and do the restoration in the British Museum labs, hopefully with a training component built in to bring over someone from Lebanon as part of the project. But as this puzzle work has gone on, I think the numbers that are potentially restorable is slowly increasing, which is really fantastic news.
Wow, how amazing. Adam, let me turn to you and talk to you perhaps a little bit about the what we might call the kind of research and discovery element of conservation. I know that conservation is your speciality. That is what you do, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you expect, with this particular piece, do you expect to be able to find out any more about Manet? I mean, an artist about whom, thank goodness, we know a very great deal. Does each project, even with such a well-known artist, does each project yield more in the way of learning?
Yes. So, I mean, although we've got very different types of objects being discussed here, I think there's certain parallels. And we would always use the major conservation treatment as an opportunity to find out about artists' materials and techniques. And we are, in parallel with the sort of science side of things, we're very fortunate to have had some major support from the AHRC Capabilities for Collections Fund, and it means we have new facilities for technical examination of paintings, amongst other things. And this will be the first project that we will have used this equipment for. So we will have a new X-ray set, a new infrared camera, and new microscopes. So that's in itself very exciting.
Lots
And
of fun toys.
yeah, yeah. So lots of amazing things have come together at once. And this is, you know, a really fantastic painting to start with. So there is that side of things, but also there's a huge body, as you mentioned, there's a huge body of knowledge about his technique and some very sophisticated doctoral work being done on his technique at the Courtauld Institute at the moment. And that was where I trained, so I have good links with them, and we've already started having conversations about you know, sharing information and things like that. So I would hope that we will make some discoveries about this painting and potentially about Manet as well. I mean, just looking at the surface in a sort of very preliminary way, I can see that there are changes to the composition around his hand and around what we call the lawyer's bands. I had to look that up because I didn't know what they were actually called. And there are some there's some wrinkling patterns in the background as well, which we're not certain about what the composition of the paint is there yet or why they're there. So there are some sort of tantalizing clues under the varnish of things we might find and stuff we can definitely look into in more detail.
Now, James mentioned another important element in these projects, which is, I mean, you mentioned training, you mentioned bringing somebody over from Beirut to work on the project. So I'm guessing that for all of you, each conservation project is actually a very important training opportunity for you know, for existing experts, but also for younger staff who have a chance to get their hands on experience, which might not always be, I mean, you can only presumably learn by doing it in the end. So Adam, tell us a little bit more about how that works within your institution. I know you mentioned before when we were talking that every big project like this involves a whole kind of knock-on effect with other people who will be doing. In other words, there's a whole load of things happening around the central project.
The social agenda in this particular organisation is very strong, and we have a duty to address this through all of our work. And so the principles of cultural democracy and the like are embedded in everything. We try to embed them in everything we do. And, you know, even in something as specialised and, you know, perceived as a sort of backroom activity as painting conservation needs to deliver in that way, and rightly so. So in this particular case, I suppose we have a sort of shift around personnel, which means that everybody gets a learning opportunity. And one of those things will be, we hope to bring in 6-month traineeship for a recent graduate. And I know I mean, you know, painting's conserved to a certain age, how tough it is in the early days. And I have always felt that quite acutely. And particularly at the moment, it's very challenging trying to find work. So I think it's what we hope to do with the traineeship is give somebody an insight into a direct experience of the breadth of working in a museum. And so they will be working in the studio with us, and they will be working on paintings conservation, but we hope that we'll be able to give them direct experience of the wider collections management, of working with a broad range of professionals, so that they can really see the depth, breadth and pace of museum work. I think it's very important these days that conservators can operate on all of those levels. And that's something that's changed. You know, the remit of the conservator these days is much broader than it was when I started out. So we felt it would be really timely to give somebody that kind of experience. And particularly in Wales as well, where, you know, the field is smaller. And so, you know, we felt it would be a really, really valuable opportunity for somebody.
Yes, absolutely. Nadine, tell me about that aspect of things from your point of view in Beirut. your colleagues must have been, you and your colleagues must have been, like everyone in the city, must have been so shocked and horrified last year when this terrible thing happened. And I know there were a lot of casualties, and it was absolutely shocking. But in museum terms as well, perhaps now a little time has passed, there's a sense that it gives an opportunity. It gives an opportunity for, well, not just the studying that we were talking about, but also for people. As a matter of fact, I think we've got a couple of images that we can now see. Ah, that's very nice. Look at that. That is absolutely incredible. Can you tell me what we're looking at here?
Yeah, it's a tiny juglet that really impressed me when I found it broken. I thought the colors from the inside were so amazing that I actually used, you know, that circle that you see, which is the base of the juglet that you see at the bottom, on the left side, bottom of the picture. I used that picture of that base of the juglet as a Christmas ball. When I sent, you know, at Christmas, I used that picture, of course, with a focus on that base. And you know, when I sent my wishes for Christmas, I thought it's just, you know, it's a perception, and that's the perception, that's the curator's, you know, lens. This is how it sees that broken vessel. It looks at it as a Christmas ball. So definitely there are so many options, you know, it's all about perception at the end, but particularly about, you know, training and students. I think this was two things happened when we were picking up those pieces. The first one is the amazing number of volunteers that we could gather to come and help the museums. And I'm not just talking about the AUB museums, I'm talking about all the museums of Beirut. This is how it looked like before the blast. You see, the colors are not that amazing, but inside the bottle, the iridescence is just absolutely breathtaking. So to go back to this, first, the number of volunteers, amazing number of people wanting to help, whether they are specialists or not. And that was absolutely beautiful. The second thing that happened while we were recovering and recollecting, and as you said, painstakingly trying to puzzle the stuff, like Fraser said, it had somehow a healing, totally unexpected though, but definitely a healing effect on the staff, on the volunteers, on the hundreds or thousands of people who are following us live on Facebook, because we did this whole recollection thing live on Facebook. And I think that was an amazing experience. I definitely didn't expect that. I was just doing what I had to do to survive. I was not thinking much, but then with time, you know, when you spend hours with other people around one cause, one thing, and you just work so hard that eventually you have this amazing feeling that you're actually achieving something. You're not maybe saving lives, but you're saving souls, and you're saving the spirit of the students. You're showing them that there are other ways to survive. There are other ways to do and to create things and to do and to be constructive. And that was, if anything, that's what I learned from that experience. And I hope that all the students and the volunteers also had their own lessons to learn from that.
Well, I'm sure they did, and it must have been a very healing experience in the wake of such a tragedy, to actually be able to do something, to put something back together again. Really extraordinary. Tell me about, I mean, this is one for all of you, really. I'm no expert in this field, as you can already tell, but I do often hear in various genres of art and artifacts that there are quite a number of controversial issues around restoration, around how much restoration you do, how you do it. I mean, in terms of painting, Adam, you know, the word over-restored is sometimes bandied around when you see things which are somehow mysteriously a lot more shiny than they ought to be or whatever. How do you as professionals and as people who are conserving work, how do you decide how much to do? I mean, I'll throw this out to anybody. I mean, James, perhaps you want to come in here. How do you decide what's too much, what you want to leave a bit rough? How do you work that out?
It's a really good question, like a heat-seeking missile, Jan. You've gone straight to the nub of the issue. And when I was developing this project and bringing our conservators at the British Museum in on the project, that was exactly their first question to me, which was, well, how much wants to be done, needs to be done? And that, of course, isn't my decision. That should be the decision of our colleagues in Beirut. And we put that back to Nadine. And the consensus was that actually, I mean, you use over-restored. I mean, in this context, not so much over-restored, but sort of completely restored. The issue here is that you can, if the conditions are right, do seamless conservation, where it's very difficult to tell where the conservation has taken place. The Portland vase, which is a very famous glass vase in the British Museum, which was broken many decades ago and was put back together, that is done seamlessly, as it should be. It was broken by a visitor one day. In this case, the decision was made that it shouldn't be seamless, that the scars of all the joins of these fragments of glass resonate, they tell a story, and that there might be parts where we don't have all the shards to go together. Some of those will have to be infilled, where the conservators create a kind of faux shard to go, just so that it's structurally sound. But if they're not needed for structural reasons, then aesthetically, then there's a choice. Do you put them in, and do you make them visible that they're there? Or do you put them in and make them seamless? Or do you not put them in at all? And in this case, we won't put them in at all, because their absence tells a story. And I think it gets back to what Nadine was saying before, that as curators, when we're displaying things, of course, it's always about stories. And this then gives these objects a new life and a new resonance. And so they tell a story about the production of glass blowing and the development of glass, which sort of comes out of Lebanon around the sort of 1st century BC AD, all that sort of thing. Really important ancient story. But by using and by being more restrained in the conservation and letting the conservation become part of the fabric of these vessels, they take on this new contemporary story as well about their role and what has happened to them in the Beirut explosion. And I think, well, to me as a curator, every single time I go into the storeroom, I smile, because to a curator and I'm sure everyone watching on Zoom, things in a museum or a gallery aren't inert and dead. They all, when I open the door of a storeroom, everything there sits buzzing on a shelf with all these potential stories to tell, just waiting for you to ask the right questions so they can be unlocked. And I think in this case, by being restrained in the conservation, we're kind of letting these stories sing, which is really exciting.
It is fabulously exciting, and that'll always be part of the existence in the museum of those things. It'll also be a record of what happened in 2020, not just what happened centuries before. That's a lovely explanation. And Adam, with paintings, how do you decide how far to go?
Well,
and what's acceptable and what's not?
It's although it's a very different sort of object, there's a lot of parallels and similarities actually in the broad principles. And so I'm just thinking about our portrait here. His story is less clear as an object, but we will still absolutely respect that and tell that through the physicality of the end product when we've done the work. And that's something, we will think of, you think about the cultural significance of the object and its meaning. And it's a conversation with the curatorial staff so that what we arrive at with the final restoration, I mean, it's likely that within a museum context, part of the story is that you can see that the compositions change subtly. That's one of the fascinating things about the object. And we if we feel that we want to tell that story, I mean, there's various ways we can do that. We can allow it to show subtly on the surface, which is probably what will happen. I would be reluctant to retouch it to the point where that becomes obscured. And that might have happened by, with restoration, 50 years ago. But these days, we're a lot more tolerant of that kind of, I suppose, patterner, I suppose, in the painting, but we're also more conscious of them as objects. You know, people often have seen paintings just purely as images, but they're an object like anything else. And the materiality of the object is something we have to think about in just as a complex way as, you know, a three-dimensional object, really. So I would hope that our treatment would be a balance of all those different factors, as well as making the image more legible. And what you will see at the end will be, you know, an old painting with signs of age, but also one that will be much more legible. And I think it's about finding a delicate balance between all those different things. And I think as conservators working with curators, we've become quite practiced at considering all of those things all at once. But I think what's important is telling that story, because to a casual visitor in a gallery, they won't see that background. And I think that that's what we can do once the painting's on the wall. You know, we can display x-rays, we can display during treatment shots, and, you know, during cleaning shots, and it's something that we can, you know, do online now as well, so it can reach everybody. So I think it's making sure that all the views are respected and all of the different facets of an object are taken into account, and then balancing all of those things. So it is quite a delicate, well, it is a literally physically delicate operation, but it's also, there's a lot of, and there's a very strong ethical side to it that people might not be aware of. And, you know, judgment and ethics is an extremely important part of what we do.
Absolutely. And from what you've both said, in fact, it sounds as if, well, I mean, I'm almost going to call it fashion. Fashions change. I mean, the idea of what's acceptable has changed over time. In other words, you neither of you wish to make your objects look in some way perfect again, because that's not what happens. But is it with paintings? Is it my imagination, or is it different in different countries? Because I find some collections. I mean, for example, I went to the Barnes collection in Philadelphia, and everything seemed so brightly coloured and shiny. And I thought, oh my goodness, these have all been sort of varnished in a whole different way that you don't see elsewhere. Now, whether that was just the light that day or whether that's actually the truth, I don't know.
I think there are, you know, culturally we have different approaches, and you will see a different approach taken in Spain, perhaps in Northern America, and we use different materials. There tend to be greater emphasis on natural materials in other countries than there are in, say, Britain or America. We tend to lean more towards synthetic materials, and aesthetics of those are, although superficially simple, can be quite different subtly. And there are also very different values internationally about the whole concept of patina. Patina is a very complicated thing once you start looking into it in any sort of depth. And so question of, you know, well, what degree do you remove a yellow varnish? What is the yellow varnish? Is it the artist's original varnish, or is it added by a restorer later on? Did they apply that varnish knowing that it might still be there in 300 years' time? You know, so there's all kinds of things that different values are based on things, and I suppose that changes. And in recent years in Britain, we've seen natural materials, so natural varnishes and things, starting to re-emerge in contemporary conservation practice. So it is an interesting thing that, you know, broadly, I'd say there are definitely different practices, but we're all learning from each other. And I can see that people are starting to sort of choose different things from different ways of working in a way that's, you know, quite sophisticated. And I've seen, you know, trategio as a retouching technique where very subtle lines are used on extensive damage. I've seen that adapted in Britain to use on, you know, British paintings when it originated to work on Italian paintings. So there's all kinds of appropriation going on, and I think that the conservation community is quite small, and we all know each other and we all talk to each other. So it's an ongoing learning process, really.
Well, of course, conservation has been hugely in the news, partly because of that is it or isn't it Leonardo, which everybody has been looking at with such interest. And of course, one of the things that we can see with that picture is the many states that it has been in its life. I'm going to turn now to some questions that are coming in. And in fact, we have got one which is about exhibition. This is from, I think it's come from Haiti. Oh, it says, I'll read it to you. Thank you for explaining all the restoration considerations. When it comes to works from Haiti, we often have paintings stabilized and strengthened, then exhibit them with the damage showing. Oh, possibly following the disaster in recent disasters. We also exhibit damaged works in their damaged state, especially if they cannot be restored. So now this is a question for Nadine, I think. Will you be exhibiting some of the AUB museum vessels in their shard form for educational purposes?
Oh, absolutely. Indeed. As I said, I mean, if at the end of the day, I mean, with all our restoration campaigns, we end up, let's say, with 22 tops, 23 objects that are fully restored, I'm sure all the rest of the shards can play different roles and tell different stories. One of them would be exhibited. Of course, that showcase, once it's back, you know, to be looked at by the public, it will have many, you know, many parts. One of them will be showcasing the fully restored objects. Another part will be actually featuring the shards. Another part probably a screen showing all the 3D reconstruction. And another part yet will maybe be recycled art, maybe with these shards. And another aspect would also be to look indeed, I mean, you can use these shards and try to, I'm going to talk about an exhibition that took place in Beirut that was absolutely amazing. And it was about paintings, actually, paintings and sculptures that had been damaged, not museum pieces, you know, private pieces that come from private homes. And there was this beautiful exhibition called the Art Blessé. It's actually the hurt, the art that has been injured. That showed these pieces, especially the paintings with lights behind the painting that actually was glowing through the, you know, the broken pieces. And it was an amazing feeling to look at these pieces and you know, try to reinterpret them and again, allow them to tell different stories and different perceptions. So yes, definitely, to answer that question, definitely several themes will be explored in the new showcase once it's done.
It'll be fun to curate that, to put it to put up the display, won't it? It'll be interesting. I love the idea of wounded art. That's it sounds quite painful, but obviously a beautiful show. I think another theme that has emerged from our talk, but also, of course, from your project, the AUB project, is about collaboration between institutions and international collaboration. And presumably for you and James, the same thing applies that Adam was talking about. In other words, there is a relatively small community of experts across the world in this field, and you can speak to each other and learn from each other. Has this project been a particularly good one in bringing institutions together?
James, you want to take that?
Yeah, it's been amazing already. And I mean, we have yet to actually start outside of the restoration work in London, but even just liaising with Nadine and her various staff has been just extraordinary and quite inspiring, actually, which has been wonderful. But I guess for us as well, the British Museum has had quite a long involvement in Beirut. We did some conservation of some mosaics in the National Museum following the Civil War. and the British Museum with some other institutions was part of excavations in Sidon. But that all sort of finished in, well, the Sidon excavations finished in 2010, I think. And so it's not that there's an opportunity to collaborate, I guess, because of course we're responding to something that is very necessary, but it is wonderful to collaborate and to build that relationship and those friendships, because the archaeology of Lebanon is extraordinary. And to be able to tell these stories in partnership is something that is a real privilege. And so this TEFAF funded project is, rather than being to one institution, although the British Museum is doing the conservation, is very much to underpin that collaboration. And well, Nadine, who knows where that will go, but it's been really, really positive, I think, from our end of this, and I'm sure from yours. And I think it's, hopefully it will grow into something really lovely.
Sounds great. Well, one of our audience wants to know, will the restored works be on display in the British Museum? Or will they, before they go home again? Presumably that's what they mean.
Yes, absolutely, is the answer to that, because this is a wonderful opportunity to showcase not only ancient glass, but also the story of Beirut and where Beirut is at the moment. And of course, to celebrate this collaboration as well. So the British Museum has what's called its Room 3 exhibition space. And that's when you come in immediately in the front doors of the British Museum. There's off to the right, just one single room.
Oh, I know that one, yeah.
And that single room is dedicated to sort of rolling exhibitions on just usually 1 or 2 objects. In this case, it'll be 8 objects, these 8 restored glass vessels from Beirut. We're not quite sure on the timing of when that will happen. That depends on when we can get the shards to London, do the conservation work, but perhaps, you know, to coincide with maybe the 2nd anniversary of the explosion in Beirut, but you know, watch this space really is the answer to that. But it's a really wonderful opportunity to co-curate, both Nadine and myself and one other colleague here at the British Museum, that exhibition as a joint Beirut British Museum exhibition, to tell the story of ancient glass and to tell these modern stories of the conservation project, and of course, what this means coming out of Beirut. I think when you think about the archaeology of the Middle East, particularly after ISIS or the Baghdad Museum or the Kabul Museum, often the Middle East gets defined by what it has lost. And I think that's a shame, because there is so much positive stuff to celebrate. And I think an exhibition like this, which we will do in this Room 3 space, should celebrate not what this collection has lost, but what this collection has gained by this. And I think that's a really powerful statement.
That's a really lovely thought. And presumably in your own holdings, you have equivalent objects? Do you have objects of the same type and period?
We've got similar objects, not precisely the same objects. And I think part of that is because a lot of the objects that were in this case that Nadine was talking about were Roman period, early Imperial Roman period. And then in the early Imperial Roman times in Lebanon, there isn't actually that many complete glass vessels. When you hit the Byzantine and the early Islamic, that's a different issue. But for that particular period and for these particular forms, especially large bowls, they're unusual, and some of them are quite rare. There's one, for example, which has got sort of almost like imitating metal ribbing around the base. That is very particular to Roman garrison camps in the Lebanon and the Syrian areas of the Levant, although it's a locally made version of what they would bring. So there's some quite particular stuff that we don't have in the British Museum. What we do have is some slightly later and some also contemporary, but mostly from Cyprus, probably made within the Lebanese heartland by Lebanese glass artisans who were highly regarded throughout the ancient world for glass manufacture, but which had been traded across to Cyprus and then discovered much later on in tombs.
Oh, well, that's a wonderful story. I have another question here. It's quite long, but I'll have to read it all out because I haven't read it myself yet. Thanks for the interesting conversation. You're welcome. I was especially moved by your perspective on artwork's value with its storytelling. I'm currently doing research on petroglyphs in South Korea. considered to be the first depiction of whaling of humanity, presumably from the Neolithic period. I hope that this turns out to be relevant somewhere. I'll keep going though. Despite its unique value, it has been considerably destroyed due to the flood caused by a dam construction, ended up losing 90% of the images on its surface in 2 to 3 years. How would you persuade the government and other stakeholders that it will still be worthy to work on this rock art, to get restored and let it get more attention of the public, especially in the context of art objects telling a story? Okay, I think what our questioner means is how you as museum professionals persuade public funders and bodies that it is worth doing this very expensive and difficult work. I think that's what is that how it came over to you? I don't know. I mean, in this case, we're talking about TEFAF. It sounds as if this person ought to apply for next year. But perhaps you've all got some experiences. We've actually only got a couple of minutes left, but if any of you have a particular experience of how you've managed to use the narrative value of an object to persuade fund givers that it is worth the conservation. Adam, you seem to be nodding your head.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think what's, comes across quite strongly in everything we've said tonight is the, cultural significance of these objects and the value that they have in people's lives. And that's why we're doing this work. And that's a really, complex phenomenon that resonates, a long way with each object. And I think expressing that in funding applications or, in display is what's important. I think, yes, the materiality of the objects is important, but, that life that they have. And I often find, I've worked here for a few years now, and the paintings here are of real significance to Wales. So people come up to me and say, I grew up with those paintings. I drew that Van Gogh when I was a little boy, and here I am standing in the conservation studio with it on an easel, and I can't believe this is actually happening. So I think it's really exploring that emotional side of objects, and which I think we've sort of tapped into. This is obviously we're online and things, but the emotional side and the human side of the stories has really been a very important part of our conversation tonight. And I think that, allowing objects to function again, even if it's in a very different way to the original context that they were made, is probably what's very important. So, and if that's teaching people, if that's healing somehow, it could be all kinds of things. And those are the sort of intangible things that I think we can gain from this kind of project, as well as getting a fabulous work object with lots of technical knowledge as well. And I think that's what we've really focused on, perhaps not even without planning it, I suppose. So that would be my suggestion.
Well, I think that's a really lovely note on which to end. I think that you're quite right. I think in both your remarkable projects, there's a huge amount of emotion and cultural sense of cultural identity, very powerfully, particularly in this amazing work from Babe Ruth and James's and Nadine's explanation of how this history of the glassmaking was so important in the Lebanon, as well as your lawyer in Wales, who knew they would ever come together. I'm so sorry that our time is up. We could go on for a long time. I've loved our conversation, and I'm sure that our audience has too. So all that remains is for me to thank you all so much for sharing your expertise and your insights and telling your remarkable stories of these brilliant projects. Congratulations. I hope they go very, very well, and I can't wait to see the work. Perhaps you can all come back next year and show us what you've done. That would be brilliant. But anyway, thank you so much, Nadine, James, and Adam.
Thank you.
Thanks.